Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here today to remember Jim, someone we fondly knew as Jim for many, many years in the Institute. And the title of my paper, and I hope it becomes clear as to why I argue that Jim was an Irish scholar but a deeply rooted cosmopolitan, because Jim was an internationalist but also deeply Irish. And when we think of Jim, not just in terms of his work on, we're here to celebrate his contribution to European integration and to Ireland's place in Europe, but he was also someone who was deeply European in many other ways. And it's interesting that just 1 month ago in Vienna, the European Geosciences Union held an equivalent event in his honour and in his memory, where his scientific colleagues celebrated his contribution to hydrology, climate change. And I think one can't understand Jim in terms of what his contribution to European integration, to the Dooge Committee and to the work of the Institute without an appreciation of Jim as a scholar, because he had an extraordinary capacity to synthesize complex arguments. And it's fitting that his last academic publication was called Bringing It All Together. And I felt I couldn't talk about him today without at least opening some of those many internationally published journal articles that he produced in hydrology. But there's an amazing one on searching for simplicity in hydrology, and the first sentence of it, when he talks about his scientific method, is something that any of us in any discipline, either the social sciences or the life sciences, could use in terms of introducing research methods and the scientific method to students. And it was that capacity that made him such a good that gave him the capacity to deal with all of these very complex political and institutional arguments. He was also an internationalist in terms of his discipline. He was president of the International Association of Hydrological Sciences for many years, president of the Royal Irish Academy. But there was one aspect of Jim's contribution to Europe that is perhaps less known than the more formal, and that is his contribution before the collapse of communism to the Academy in the eastern half of the continent. Jim started to engage with the Academy in the eastern half of the continent as early as 1973. For him, there was no Cold War or there was no Berlin Wall. And from 1973 onwards, he had very strong links to the Polish Academy of Sciences and brought academics from the Polish Academy of Sciences to UCD and wrote with them. And in fact, his last publication that he co-authored with a Polish academic was as late as 2007. So it was not for no reason that when we read in the Dooge report that although the Dooge report is focusing on what was the then European community, that it was felt that there was also a recall of the civilization that the western half of the continent shared with the rest of Europe. And he was always deeply European in its widest and deepest sense. He was not someone who focused on Western Europe. And I think that is it was a very important contribution he brought to us in Ireland, because we were quite far away from that eastern half of the continent. Also, Jim was deeply Irish. Those of us who were part of the last mass that celebrated his life, it was entirely Oscailge. There wasn't a word of English spoken for the entire mass. And he was, as we know, and I will say later, he also contributed to the establishment of Scoil Con, one of the very early Gael skulls in the city. But for him also, Ireland's membership of the EU was absolutely central. And as a senator from 1961 to 77, he spoke many times in the Seanad on EU affairs. And I think that to sum up what he felt about Ireland's relationship with the EU is probably best captured in the title of the book he co-authored with Ruth Barrington, which is called A Vital National Interest, Ireland and Europe. For him, Ireland in the EU, as part of the European Union, the European community, was that central as an anchor to the Irish state and to its people. He was also a long-standing member of the Irish Council of the European Movement, and I remember being a member of the executive of that organisation with him in the late 1970s and 1980s. But of course, his major contribution, formal contribution to European integration was his chairmanship of the Ad Hoc Committee on Institutional Affairs. And that was established at a very important turning point in the history of the EU. And By chairing that committee, Jim joins people like Spaak and Tindemans, Spinelli, Spierenberg, Delors, Padua-Schwarpe later, and Sapir, those who lent their names to landmark reports on the European Union and the European communities. And at that time, there's no doubt that with the first and second oil crisis and into the early 1980s, the member states of the EU had many common problems but no common solutions. The British budgetary problem, as Helen has written very much on that topic at that time, solving it proved very elusive, and it was draining the system of political capacity at that time. And it appeared certainly at that time as if the EU was not going to be, that the then European community could not, in fact, be part of the solution for its member states. But Fontainebleau, 1984, François Mitterrand, after what is perhaps in the history of the EU one of the most activist presidencies of the Council, François Mitterrand ended in Fontainebleau with at least a solution to the British problem, and that allowed then for space to look at the institutional issues. It allowed for the establishment of those two committees, one Jim's committee, the Ad Hoc Institutional Affairs Committee, and the other on a People's Europe. The fact that Jim ended up chairing it was based entirely on the fact that Ireland was taking over the presidency of the Council and that it was up to the president, the incoming president of the Council, to begin the work of what was to be this Institutional Affairs Committee. And he nominated Jim, and as these things are never smooth in the EU, there were objections. The Belgians thought that maybe because of Spaak it should be a Belgian, and the Germans thought, well, maybe it should be a former German president. But in the end, Garrett as Taoiseach prevailed, and Jim became chair of that committee. And of course, those of us who have been chaired by Jim will know that they're perhaps, and I'm looking at the only other person I've ever come across, Ben Tunra, who's as good a chair as Jim Dooge. Both were awesome chairs. And Jim had that extraordinary capacity to allow a discussion develop, to allow everyone feel that they had sufficient voice during the discussion, and he always seemed to know when to rein it in, and it was uncanny. He always seemed to know when he had given enough rope but not too much rope, and when he needed to bring it back in. And the others around the table with him would not have known of that capacity that he had, but that was, I'm sure Catherine, who acted as part of the Secretariat, will attest to the extraordinary powers he had as a chairman. This group of people who sat around the table were personal representatives of their heads of government. It was very much high politics. They were not there to draft a legal text. They were there to move the debate on politically. And they were a mixture, people like Maurice Fauré, who had signed the Rome Treaty. He was obviously the father of the event. There were MEPs and all sorts of personal representatives of all kinds, diplomats around that table. And one of the seminal pieces of work on the Dooge Committee was written by Patrick Keating and Anna Murphy. And they identify the fact that it was the importance of the chair in the Dooge process was the informal contacts among the groups, rather than acting as a primary source of innovation or as the person who offered the solutions, that it was to ensure that there was enough meat on the table to get the debate moving. And the committee was tasked with trying to improve the workings of the EU. And Garrett, in his letter to Jim, thought that perhaps they should look at the functioning and decision-making of the institutions, the effectiveness of the community in the socio-economic sphere, the modalities for common action in new fields, and then progress towards something ill-defined called European Union. Essentially, they were looking at three things. They were looking at how the community did its business, what business it should do, and how it could make progress towards the Holy Grail of European Union. It met on 11 occasions, produced its work on time, and also, I think, thanks to Jim, it actually reads extraordinarily well. It is it's a very good document. It was an exercise in mapping, sifting, and filtering areas of agreement and disagreement among the then 10 member states. And their role was to secure the maximum degree of consensus around the table. And critical to this in terms of the presentation of the document is that rather than allow the problems to emerge in the text of the document, everyone was allowed footnote. So it becomes the most interesting part of this document are the footnotes. And I think I counted there well over 30 footnotes. But if you want the meat of the Dooge report, it is the footnotes, because that's where the problems emerged. Those were the things that they couldn't agree on, or where one or other member state had a problem. In terms of... it doesn't matter anyway. I don't need it. No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah. No, I thought we should have some nice photographs. In terms of the main text of the report, it looked at what the priority objectives were, how those objectives could be achieved, and then finally what should happen afterwards. And it was interesting that a lot of the issues that still bedevil European integration were there. There was the tension on, in that document, on what convergence meant in the EU. Was it convergence of economic performance, or was it convergence of economic policy? The Germans, convergence of economic policy. Everyone else, and particularly the poorer states, it was convergence of economic performance. And we know that that problem in the EU is back to haunt the system. Again, there was also disagreement on the question of solidarity, what solidarity meant, particularly the Greeks and the Irish on solidarity. So the need to develop a technological community, the strengthening of EMS, although a single currency isn't mentioned, but also the core goal of the internal market, a genuine internal market. This is the kind of language. The second set of priorities looked at the promotion of common values, and that related again very much at the time to specific areas like the environment, the achievement of a European social area, a judicial area, and interestingly, given how contested and difficult judicial cooperation has proven to be in the EU, there were no footnotes on judicial cooperation in the 1980s. Obviously, those around the table didn't quite know how deep it might bite if it ever came to pass. And then there was a section on the promotion of common cultural values in Europe. But that part had very few footnotes. So technological cooperation, a lot of these areas, environmental cooperation, were not subject to many footnotes. Then, of course, the third was the external identity of the community. And there, Jim exercised his role as representative of an Irish Prime Minister and entered a reservation on an entire section on security and defence, as one could have anticipated given the times that were in it, and Ireland was still struggling to come to terms with what Irish neutrality meant. And then finally, there's a section on, still is, probably, yeah, says Patrick, on the means. And here, very much the argument was that this required, the means was the meat of the Dooge report. That was the institutional questions. And two things strike me about it. It was a highly contested area, and the biggest area of contestation was around qualified majority voting. That was the only part of the text where two options were offered, a majority and a minority option. But it was clear at that stage that the strength of the veto, the Luxembourg compromise, was ebbing in the Union. Also, an interesting section on the Commission, and one that wouldn't be written today. It was calling very much for a strengthening of the role of the Commission, and I don't think any group of representatives of the 27 member states would in fact pen that today. So again, it tells us that there's been extraordinary institutional change and shift in the EU in that period. And then finally, what should be done afterwards? And this group very much called for an IGC and for a formal change of the treaties, the first major change and shift in the treaties since the establishment of the EU. So what can we say in terms of the impact of this committee? I think it must be seen very much against a backdrop of the times. There was a growing commitment and movement and wind behind treaty change in the EU. Otherwise, the report would simply have headed for the shelves and joined all the other reports that had been done, like Tindemans, before that. But there was a sufficient convergence of preferences among the member states and also a sufficient commitment to institutional change that it became the recipe for what emerged as the Single European Act. But also it required extraordinary management by the Italian authorities in terms of getting agreement on an IGC in Milan, because I don't think very many people going in, other than the Italian presidency, thought that that would be the outcome, or even that that was on the table. But unfortunately, Mrs. Thatcher was badly caught. She didn't anticipate a vote, and of course it was the first time the European Council ever voted, and voted in favour. And Ireland positioned itself in Milan as part with the six. Again, it was very much the inner six and Ireland, and the three footnote countries in Milan were Greece, Denmark and the United Kingdom. And of course, Greece, Denmark and the United Kingdom, Greece and Denmark, two small states, were unlikely to be able to prevent a successful outcome of an IGC, which left the United Kingdom faced with an IGC that its agreement was needed in order for a treaty change to emerge. But of course, what was central to the Single European Act was the internal market, and that was something that the Thatcher government was very committed to. And on that turned the success of the Institutional Affairs Committee. But what came with the agreement on the internal market was majority voting, the beginning of powers for the European Parliament, and the doubling of the structural funds. Things that I don't think many people around the table realised or understood just how far-reaching they would be in the long term. Many of the issues that were dealt with in the Dooge report continued to confront the EU, but in terms of it helped develop the broad outline of what emerged as a yesable package for the member states. And therefore, because it was the first significant reform of the Rome treaties, I think in that sense it can be called the SPAC II committee, rather than that it was the SPAC II committee in terms of reproducing what the early SPAC committee did. Jim was an extraordinary man. I'm going to end by showing you a beautiful photograph that's taken on the steps out there. It was at the launch of the Constitution Building book in 1969, where my two young daughters were very bored by the happenings in here as people were nattering away, and went out and sat out on the steps, and Jim joined them. And thereafter, every time I met him over many, many years, he always asked about his girls. And he had only one conversation with them on the table out there. But he did contribute to them in a very real way, because all my children went to Scoil Con, and they all had a great education because Jim and a small group of people set that school up in the 1950s against extraordinary odds. So I feel a very personal appreciation of what he did, and not just in terms of what he did for the European Union, but also what he did in his local area. He was also deeply, when I say a rooted person, he was rooted not just to Ireland, but to Monkstown. Thank you very much.